Tonight, let us drift back to a different sky, a quieter sky, a sky learning to carry people again, not bombs. The year is 1947. The Second World War has ended only 2 years ago, and the world is still catching its breath. Runways that once thundered with bombers now wait patiently for civilian aircraft. The transformation from war to peace is nowhere more visible than in the aviation industry, where thousands of military aircraft are being converted for peaceful purposes, and experienced bomber crews are seeking new lives in the emerging world of commercial aviation. In this twilight period between war and the modern age of flight, we find our story. A story of an aircraft called Stardust, 11 souls aboard, and a single word that would haunt investigators for over 50 years. This is a story told softly, so you can rest. A story with puzzles and patient answers. A story about ice, wind, and the last message ever heard from a plane that simply vanished into the clouds above the Andes Mountains. Picture London in early 1946. The city bears the scars of the Blitz, but there's something new in the air, literally. On January 1st, 1946, a silver aircraft named Starlight makes history by conducting the very first flight from Britain's newly opened Heathrow Airport. The destination? South America, across an ocean and a continent, to cities with names like Music, Buenos Aires, Santiago, Montevideo. This inaugural flight belongs to British South American Airways, known simply as BSAA. The company has an ambitious vision to connect post-war Britain with the emerging markets of South America using converted bomber aircraft. It's a romantic notion, born from necessity and seasoned with just enough danger to make it profitable. BSAA was originally formed during the war as British Latin American Airlines, created by shipping companies who saw the future arriving on wings instead of waves. By August 1946, under new government ownership, the airline employed over 1,000 people and had already proven something remarkable. While Britain's other national carriers lost millions of pounds in their first year, BSA turned a profit. The aircraft that would make these long journeys possible were marvels of adaptation. Take the Avro Lancastrian, civilian cousin to the mighty Lancaster bomber. Where gun turrets once protected bomber crews, now streamlined metal fairings created a sleek profile. Where bombs once hung in dark bays, extra fuel tanks extended the aircraft's range across oceans. The nose, once glazed for a bomb aimer's view, now housed the captain and first officer in a flight deck that looked toward peaceful horizons. These conversions were more than mechanical. They were philosophical. Aircraft designed to carry destruction were learning to carry hope. Crews trained for combat were navigating by stars they once used to find enemy cities, but now those same stars guided them toward reunion dinners and business meetings, toward letters delivered and families reunited. The technology of 1947 would seem primitive by today's standards, yet it represented the cutting edge of its time. Navigation relied on dead reckoning, the art of calculating position using compass headings, airspeed, and time. Radio beacons provided some guidance, but only within 200 miles of their transmission. Beyond that, pilots relied on celestial navigation, reading the sun and stars through a sextant, weather permitting. Weather forecasting itself was an imprecise science. Meteorologists knew about pressure systems and could predict general conditions, but they had little understanding of high-altitude phenomena. The jet stream, the fast river of air that flows around the globe at cruising altitude, was known to exist, but poorly understood in practical terms. Pilots flying the South American routes would learn about these wind patterns through experience, sometimes dangerous experience. Communication was conducted in the clipped language of Morse code. Radio operators, many of them veterans of wartime. Service would tap out messages in the dots and dashes that formed the international language of aviation. ETA Santiago, 1745 hours, became a series of rapid electric pulses, traveling through the ether to reach ground stations thousands of miles away. The passengers who chose to fly these routes were pioneers of sorts. Air travel in 1947 was expensive, uncomfortable, and often dangerous. A flight from London to Santiago might take 5 days with multiple stops for fuel and rest. Passengers endured unpressurized cabins, basic heating, and the constant drone of engines. Yet for those who could afford it, flying meant compressing weeks of sea travel into days, trading comfort for speed. These early passengers were diplomats carrying urgent communications, businessmen chasing opportunities in post-war reconstruction, families separated by war and eager for reunion. Each had their own story, their own reason for trusting their lives to these converted bombers and their experienced crews. Among BSAA's fleet, certain aircraft gained reputations. Starlight, the pioneering first flight. Star Mist, a reliable York Transport, and Stardust, an Avro Lancastrian with a graceful name and a spotless safety record. She was powered by Packard-built Merlin engines, the same reliable power plants that had carried so many bombers home during the war. Her maximum speed was 220 miles per hour, respectable for her era, and she could climb above 24,000 feet, high enough to clear even the mighty Andes. The routes these aircraft flew were ambitious beyond anything attempted in peacetime. London to Buenos Aires via Lisbon, Bathurst in West Africa, Natal in Brazil, then Rio de Janeiro, and Montevideo. From Buenos Aires, a twice-weekly service continued over the Andes to Santiago, Chile, a journey that required climbing to maximum altitude and flying in conditions where the slightest navigation error could be fatal. The Andes crossing was particularly challenging. These mountains rise abruptly from the Argentine plains to peaks over 22,000 feet. The weather can change in minutes, from clear skies to whiteout conditions. Winds howl through passes and create turbulence that can throw even a large aircraft around like a leaf. In 1947, there were no weather radar systems, no satellite imagery, no precision navigation aids. Pilots flew these routes using skill, experience, and more than a little faith. The men and women who crewed these aircraft were exceptional. Captain Reginald Cook held the Distinguished Service Order, Distinguished Flying Cross, and Distinguished Flying Medal, decorations that spoke of courage under fire and skill under pressure. First Officer Norman Hilton Cook, despite sharing the captain's surname, was unrelated but equally experienced, another Royal Air Force veteran who had traded combat missions for commercial routes. Second Officer Donald Checklin also wore the ribbon of the Distinguished Flying Cross, representing the high caliber of crew that BSAA attracted. These were men who had navigated through flak-filled skies over Europe, who had brought damaged bombers home on one engine, who had landed in weather that would ground aircraft today. They approached commercial aviation with the same professional competence that had seen them through war, understanding that peacetime flying presented its own unique challenges. The radio operator on these flights was Dennis Harmer, a specialist in the rapid Morse communication that kept aircraft in contact with the ground. His role was crucial on these long-distance routes, where position reports and weather updates could mean the difference between a successful flight and disaster. Harmer was known for his clear, professional transmissions, his ability to maintain communication even under difficult conditions. The flight attendant, known in BSAA terminology as a Star Girl, was Iris Maureen Evans, formerly of the Women's Royal Naval Service. Like many of her male colleagues, she had served her country during the war and now applied that same dedication to passenger service. In the informal atmosphere of early commercial aviation, flight attendants were part safety officer, part hostess, part nurse, ready to handle any situation that might arise during the long journey. On the morning of July the 29th, 1947, passengers began gathering at London's newly opened Heathrow Airport for BSAA Flight Star Mist. The aircraft, an Avro York, would carry them on the first leg of a journey to South America, with connections in Buenos Aires for those continuing to Chile. Each passenger had their own story, their own reason for making this expensive and somewhat dangerous journey. In an era when international travel was still rare and exotic, these individuals represented a cross-section of post-war society: businessmen, diplomats, emigrants, and those seeking new opportunities in a world still rebuilding from devastation. Paul Simpson traveled as a king's messenger, one of the British government's most trusted couriers. His red diplomatic bag, sealed with wax and ribbon, contained classified documents for the British Embassy in Santiago. The King's Messenger service was ancient and honorable, dating back centuries, and Simpson carried on a tradition of personal responsibility for state secrets that no electronic communication could replace. His journey would take him from the corridors of Whitehall to the heights of the Andes, carrying information that might affect relations between nations. Marta Limpert's story was particularly poignant. A German woman who had been stranded in her homeland during the war, she was finally able to return to Chile, where she had made her life before the conflict. The war had separated her from her husband, and now she traveled alone, carrying with her the ashes of her deceased spouse. For Limpert, this flight represented not just a journey home, but the completion of a promise, the final act of a love story interrupted by global conflict. Cassis, Said Atala, a Palestinian businessman, was returning to Chile after visiting his dying mother. The journey had been urgent and difficult, requiring precious exit permits and currency exchanges in a world still sorting out its borders and bureaucracies. According to some accounts, Atala carried a diamond sewn into the lining of his suit, either as payment for his mother's care or as insurance against an uncertain future. Such precautions were common in an era when banks were unreliable and currencies unstable. Harold Pog, described by those who knew him as a fun-loving Swiss businessman, represented the entrepreneurial spirit of the post-war era. Men like Pog saw opportunity in the reconstruction of war-torn economies and were willing to travel to distant continents to pursue those opportunities. His presence on the flight spoke to the growing international nature of commerce, the way business was beginning to transcend national boundaries. Jack Gooderham and Peter Young were British businessmen, part of the wave of commercial representatives, exploring South American markets. Young worked for Dunlop, the tire company, seeking to establish relationships with South American distributors. These men were pioneers of international business, building the commercial relationships that would define the post-war global economy. The passengers who boarded Star Mist in London could not have known that their names would become part of Aviation. History, that their final journey would be dissected and analyzed by investigators for decades to come. They were ordinary people, living extraordinary lives in an extraordinary time, when international travel was still an adventure and the future seemed full of possibility. The first part of their journey proceeded normally. Star Mist carried them safely across Europe and Africa, over the South Atlantic to Brazil, then south to Buenos Aires. This was the routine portion of their trip, following established routes with regular fuel stops and overnight rests. The passengers settled into the rhythm of long-distance travel, the drone of engines, the view of landscapes unreeling below, the strange intimacy that develops among travelers sharing an adventure. In Buenos Aires, they transferred to Stardust, the Avro Lancastrian, that would carry them over the Andes to Santiago. This transfer was routine. BSAA regularly used different aircraft for different portions of the route, matching the right plane to the right mission. The York was better suited for the long ocean crossings, while the Lancastrian's high-altitude capability made it ideal for the mountain crossing. The passengers who boarded Stardust on the morning of August 2nd, 1947, were looking forward to the final leg of their journey. Santiago was only a few hours away, just over the mountains. They had traveled thousands of miles safely. What could go wrong in the last few hundred? They could not have known that they were about to become part of one of aviation's most enduring mysteries, that their final flight would be remembered and studied long after the reasons for their travel were forgotten. They settled into their seats, watched the Argentine countryside fall away below, and prepared for what should have been a routine crossing of the Andes. Instead, they were flying toward immortality, toward a fate that would puzzle investigators for over half a century and make their names part of aviation legend. In a few hours, Stardust would simply vanish, taking with her 11 souls and leaving behind only questions, theories, and a single mysterious word that would haunt everyone who heard it. To understand what happened to Stardust, we must first understand the world of aviation in 1947, a world that seems almost primitive by today's standards, yet represented the absolute cutting edge of technology for its time. The Avro Lancastrian that carried the name Stardust was registration GAGWH, construction number 664. She had rolled out of A.V. Rowe's factory in Manchester as one of the first civilian conversions of the famous Lancaster bomber. Where her military sisters carried bombs and defensive armament, Stardust was fitted with passenger windows, insulation, and heating systems designed to make long-distance travel tolerable, if not exactly comfortable. Her 4 engines were Packard-built, Merlin 38s, 12-cylinder liquid-cooled power plants that had proved their reliability in thousands of wartime missions. Each engine produced over 1,200 horsepower, giving Stardust a maximum speed of 220 miles per hour and a service ceiling above 24,000 feet. This high-altitude capability was essential for crossing the Andes, where peaks rose above 22,000 feet and mountain waves could create turbulence at even higher altitudes. The Merlin engines were marvels of engineering, their superchargers automatically adjusting to maintain power as the aircraft climbed into thinner air. At 24,000 feet, where Stardust would fly over the Andes, the air pressure was less than half that at sea level, requiring the superchargers to work at maximum capacity to keep the engines running smoothly. But it wasn't just the engines that made high-altitude flight challenging in 1947. The aircraft was unpressurized, meaning that passengers and crew had to rely on portable oxygen systems once they climbed above 10,000 feet. The temperature at 24,000 feet could drop to minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit, requiring extensive heating systems to keep the cabin habitable. Navigation in 1947 was an art as much as a science. The primary method was dead reckoning, a process that required constant attention to compass headings, airspeed, and elapsed time. Every few minutes, the navigator would plot the aircraft's estimated position on a chart, taking into account factors like wind speed and direction, variations in airspeed, and the inevitable small errors that accumulated during flight. Dead reckoning was accurate enough for most purposes, but it had inherent limitations. Wind speed and direction could change without warning, particularly in mountainous terrain. A stronger headwind than expected could slow the aircraft significantly, causing it to fall behind its planned position without the crew realizing it immediately. Conversely, an unexpected tailwind could push the aircraft ahead of schedule, creating confusion about actual position. To supplement dead reckoning, aircraft carried radio equipment capable of receiving signals from ground-based beacons. These low-frequency radio ranges could provide bearing information, allowing navigators to triangulate their position using signals from multiple stations. However, the effective range of these beacons was limited to about 200 miles, and mountainous terrain could block or distort signals, making them unreliable in precisely the areas where accurate navigation was most critical. For long distance flights over areas without radio coverage, celestial navigation remained important. Using a sextant to measure the angle between celestial bodies and the horizon, navigators could determine their position with reasonable accuracy. This method required clear weather and a stable platform, conditions that weren't always available over the Andes, where clouds often obscured the sun and stars, and turbulence made sextant observations difficult. Communication between aircraft and ground stations relied entirely on Morse code transmitted via high-frequency radio. Radio operators like Dennis Harmer were skilled in the rapid transmission and reception of coded messages, able to send and receive at speeds that would challenge modern operators. A typical position report might include the aircraft's current location, altitude, fuel remaining, and estimated time of arrival at the next checkpoint. The quality of radio communication depended on many factors: atmospheric conditions, the time of day, solar activity, and the skill of both the airborne and ground operators. High-frequency radio signals could propagate over vast distances under the right conditions, but they could also fade to nothing without warning, leaving aircraft temporarily isolated from ground contact. Weather forecasting in 1947 was primitive by modern standards. Meteorologists could track major pressure systems and provide general forecasts, but they had little understanding of high-altitude phenomena that affected aircraft operation. The jet stream, that fast-moving river of air that circles the globe at cruising altitudes, was known to exist but poorly understood in practical terms. The jet stream's existence had been confirmed during high-altitude bomber operations in World War II, when crews reported dramatically different ground speeds depending on their direction of flight. Westbound flights sometimes encountered headwinds so strong that they barely made forward progress, while eastbound flights could arrive hours ahead of schedule. But the precise location, speed, and altitude of these high-altitude winds remained unpredictable. For flights over the Andes, the jet stream presented a particular challenge. The mountains could accelerate and deflect these high-altitude winds, creating conditions where an aircraft might encounter headwinds far stronger than forecast. If a crew calculated their position based on expected ground speed, a stronger than anticipated headwind could leave them miles behind their estimated position without their knowledge. The instruments available to pilots in 1947 were basic but functional. The primary flight instruments, airspeed indicator, altimeter, artificial horizon, and magnetic compass, provided the information needed to control the aircraft safely. Engine instruments monitored oil pressure, cylinder head temperature, and fuel flow for each of the 4 Merlin engines. However, there were no weather radars to detect storms ahead, no ground proximity warning systems to alert crews to nearby. Terrain, no satellite navigation systems to provide continuous position updates. Pilots flew by skill, experience, and judgment, making decisions based on incomplete information in constantly changing conditions. The altimeter, one of the most critical instruments for mountain flying, measured altitude by sensing atmospherics, pressure. As the aircraft climbed, decreasing air pressure caused the altimeter to indicate increasing altitude. This system worked well under normal conditions, but it had limitations that could prove dangerous in mountain flying. Altimeters indicated height above sea level only if set to the correct barometric pressure reference. If the pressure setting was incorrect, or if atmospheric pressure changed during flight, the altimeter could show an altitude significantly different from the aircraft's actual height above the ground. Over mountainous terrain, where peaks rose, above 20,000 feet, even small altimeter errors could be fatal. The crew of Stardust understood these limitations and had trained to work within them. They represented the best of their generation, experienced, professional, and cautious. Captain Cook's wartime decorations spoke to his skill and courage, while his peacetime record demonstrated his competence in commercial operations. The entire crew had hundreds of hours of experience on the South American routes, and they understood the unique challenges of Andes crossings. Yet even the most experienced crew could be defeated by a combination of factors beyond their control: unexpected weather, navigation errors, instrument limitations, and the simple fact that in 1947, flying remained an inherently risky endeavor. The technology that would make aviation truly safe, pressurized cabins, weather radar, precision navigation, ground proximity warning systems, still lay years in the future. The aircraft that took off from Buenos Aires on the afternoon of August 2nd, 1947, represented the pinnacle of aviation technology for its era. But it was still a machine operating at the limits of what was possible, crewed by humans making decisions based on incomplete information, flying through an environment that could change from benign to deadly in minutes. This was the world of Stardust, a world of courage and competence, of magnificent machines and skilled crews, but also a world where the margin for error was razor thin and where a combination of small mistakes or unexpected conditions could lead to tragedy. British South American Airways operated some of the world's most challenging commercial routes, connecting London with cities across South America through a network that demanded exceptional skill from both crews and ground support personnel. These routes pushed the boundaries of what was possible in commercial aviation, crossing vast oceans, hostile deserts, and treacherous mountain ranges. The flagship route began at London's Heathrow Airport, itself a symbol of Britain's post-war optimism. Heathrow had opened just 2 years earlier, built on the site of a wartime bomber field, and BSAA's Starlight had made the very first commercial departure from the new facility. From London, the route stretched southwest across the Bay of Biscay to Lisbon, where aircraft refueled before undertaking the long overwater flight to West Africa. The Atlantic, crossing from Lisbon to Bathurst, in what is now Gambia, required careful fuel management and precise navigation. Aircraft flew for hours over open ocean, beyond the range of radio beacons, relying entirely on dead reckoning and celestial navigation. This segment tested both equipment and crew endurance, with no opportunity for emergency landings if problems developed. From Bathurst, the route continued south along the African coast to Natal, Brazil, crossing the narrowest part of the South Atlantic. This overwater segment was shorter than the Lisbon-Bathurst leg, but it still required several hours of flight with no landfall options. Weather over the tropical Atlantic could change rapidly, and thunderstorms posed a constant threat to aircraft. Lacking weather radar, Natal served as a crucial refueling stop and crew rest point. The Brazilian city had grown into an important aviation hub during World War II, when it served as a staging point for aircraft ferrying supplies to North Africa. By 1947, Natal had the facilities and expertise to support commercial operations, but it remained a challenging destination where heat, humidity, and unpredictable weather tested both aircraft and crews. From Natal, the route continued south to Rio de Janeiro, then Montevideo, and finally Buenos Aires. Each segment presented its own challenges: navigation over the vast Brazilian interior, weather systems moving up from Patagonia, and the complex approach procedures required at each destination airport. But it was the route from Buenos Aires to Santiago that earned BSAA its reputation for daring. This transcontinental crossing of the Andes Mountains required aircraft to climb to their maximum altitude and maintain precise navigation through some of the world's most unforgiving terrain. The Andes Mountains rise abruptly from the Argentine plains, their peaks reaching above 22,000 feet. Mount Aconcagua, the highest peak in the Americas, towers to 22,841 feet just north of the Buenos Aires-Santiago route. Even aircraft capable of climbing to 24,000 feet had little margin for error when crossing these peaks. Weather over the Andes was notoriously unpredictable. Clear skies at departure could give way to violent storms within hours. Mountain waves, atmospheric disturbances created by wind flowing over peaks, could generate turbulence severe enough to break up aircraft. Temperatures at altitude could drop to minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit, threatening fuel lines and instruments. The route from Buenos Aires to Santiago followed a direct path across the mountains, with no opportunity for emergency landings between departure and arrival. If an aircraft encountered problems during the crossing, the crew's options were limited: continue to Santiago, return to Buenos Aires, or attempt a forced landing in terrain that offered little chance of survival. Navigation on this route was particularly challenging. The high mountains blocked radio signals, leaving crews to rely primarily on dead reckoning during the most dangerous portion of the flight. Cloud cover often prevented celestial navigation, and the jet stream could create headwinds or tailwinds that affected ground speed without the crew's immediate knowledge. BSAA crews who flew this route developed a healthy respect for the Andes. They understood that successful mountain flying required conservative decision-making, careful fuel management, and constant attention to weather conditions. Even experienced pilots approached these flights with caution, knowing that the mountains were unforgiving of mistakes. The aircraft used on the Andes crossing were specially chosen for their high-altitude capability. The Avro Lancastrian, with its 4 supercharged Merlin engines, could maintain cruise power at 24,000 feet, providing the performance needed to clear the highest peaks with a reasonable safety margin. The aircraft's unpressurized cabin required oxygen equipment for passengers and crew, adding complexity to an already challenging operation. Fuel planning for the Andes crossing was critical. Aircraft had to carry enough fuel to reach Santiago under normal conditions, plus reserves for unexpected headwinds, diversions, or holding patterns. The Lancastrian's extra fuel tanks, installed in the former bomb bay, provided the range needed for these long overwater and over-mountain segments. The crews who flew these routes were among the most experienced in commercial aviation. Many had served as bomber pilots during World War II, giving them experience with long-distance navigation, high-altitude flight, and operation under pressure. They understood the importance of precise procedures and conservative decision-making when flying in hostile environments. Ground support for these routes required careful coordination between multiple countries and airlines. Weather reports had to be collected and transmitted across vast distances. fuel supplies maintained at remote airports, and emergency services, coordinated for potential search and rescue operations. The international nature of these operations added complexity to an already challenging undertaking. Despite the dangers, BSAA's South American routes were commercially successful. Passengers were willing to pay premium prices for fast transportation across vast distances, and the airline's safety record, while not perfect, was acceptable for the era. The combination of experienced crews, reliable aircraft, and careful operational procedures made these ambitious routes viable. However, the margins for safety were always thin. The combination of hostile terrain, primitive navigation aids, unpredictable weather, and aircraft operating at the limits of their capability meant that even small problems could escalate into disasters. BSAA would learn this lesson repeatedly. As the airline faced a series of tragic losses in the late 1940s, the route that Stardust flew on August 2, 1947, was well established by the standards of the time. BSAA had been operating the Buenos Aires-Santiago service for over a year, and the crew had flown this route multiple times. They understood the challenges and had developed procedures to manage the risks. Yet the Andes Mountains cared nothing for experience or procedures. They remained as dangerous as ever, waiting patiently for the combination of circumstances that would claim another aircraft and add another chapter to the growing legend of aviation's most challenging routes. The morning of August 2nd, 1947, dawned clear and warm in Buenos Aires. At Morón Airport, Stardust sat on the tarmac, her silver skin gleaming in the early sunlight. Ground crews bustled around the aircraft, conducting the careful pre-flight inspections that were even more critical for high-altitude mountain flying than normal operations. Captain Reginald Cook arrived early, as was his habit, a man of medium height. With the bearing of a professional military officer, Cook carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had faced danger many times and survived through skill and caution. His logbook recorded thousands of hours of flight time, including combat missions over Europe and peacetime flights across the South American routes he had come to know intimately. First, Officer Norman Cook, no relation to the captain despite their shared surname, joined the pre-flight briefing with a methodical attention to detail that had served him well during his wartime service. The two men worked together with the easy familiarity of professionals who trusted each other's competence completely. Second Officer Donald Checklin brought navigation charts and weather reports to the crew briefing. As the aircraft's navigator, he bore responsibility for plotting the route across the Andes and calculating fuel requirements for the crossing. His wartime experience with long-range navigation over hostile territory had prepared him well for the challenges of commercial flying, where precision was just as important as in combat operations. Radio operator Dennis Harmer checked and double-checked his communication equipment. The high-frequency radios that would keep Stardust in contact with ground stations were complex devices requiring careful tuning and constant attention. Harmer's reputation for clear, professional communication was well established, and his skill would be crucial during the mountain crossing, where maintaining contact with Santiago approach control could mean the difference between a successful flight and disaster. Flight attendant Iris Evans conducted her own preparations, ensuring that passenger oxygen equipment was properly positioned and that emergency supplies were correctly stowed. Her wartime service with the Women's Royal Naval Service had taught her the importance of thorough preparation and calm competence under pressure. The passengers began arriving at the airport in the early afternoon. They had spent the night in Buenos Aires, recovering from the long journey from London and preparing for the final leg of their trip to Santiago. For most, this would be their first flight over the Andes, and they looked forward to seeing the mighty mountains from the air. Paul Simpson, the king's messenger, carried his diplomatic pouch with characteristic discretion. The classified documents it contained were bound for the British Embassy in Santiago, part of the continuous flow of communication that kept the empire functioning in an era before secure electronic communication. Marta Limpert held a small container that contained her husband's ashes. The long journey from Germany to Chile had been emotionally exhausting, but she was finally nearing her goal of returning to her adopted homeland and laying her husband to rest in the soil of South America. The other passengers, businessmen, emigrants, travelers, each carried their own hopes and concerns as they prepared to complete their transcontinental journey. They had traveled thousands of miles safely. Santiago was only a few hours away over the mountains. At 1:46 in the afternoon, Stardust began her takeoff roll from Morón Airport. The four Merlin engines roared to full power, their superchargers already beginning to compensate for the decreased air density as the aircraft climbed away from Buenos Aires. Captain Cook held the aircraft in a steady climb, heading west towards Aguay, the wall of mountains that rose from the Argentine plains like a barrier between nations. The first hour of flight passed normally. Stardust crossed the flat pampas at a steady climb rate, her engines maintaining cruise power as the altimeter wound steadily upward. The The passengers settled into their seats, watching the Argentine countryside pass beneath them as they approached the foothills of the Andes. At 15,000 feet, portable oxygen equipment was distributed to the passengers. The unpressurized cabin made supplemental oxygen necessary as the aircraft continued climbing toward its planned cruising altitude of 24,000 feet. This was routine procedure for high-altitude flights, and the passengers accepted the inconvenience as part of the adventure of modern aviation. Navigation during the early part of the flight relied on familiar landmarks and radio beacons from Argentine stations. Second Officer Checklin plotted regular position fixes, confirming that Stardust was maintaining her planned course and making good time toward the mountains. The weather appeared favorable, with scattered clouds but good visibility. As the aircraft approached the Andes proper, the landscape below began to change dramatically. The flat plains gave way to rolling hills, then to steep-sided valleys carved by ancient glaciers. Snow-covered peaks appeared on the horizon, growing larger and more imposing as Stardust continued her westward flight. At 24,000 feet, the aircraft reached its planned cruising altitude. The temperature outside had dropped to minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit, but the cabin heating system maintained tolerable conditions for the passengers. The engines continued to run smoothly, their superchargers working hard to maintain power in the thin air. The mountains below were magnificent and terrible. Peaks rose all around the aircraft, some of them reaching nearly as high as Stardust's. Cruising altitude. Snowfields and glaciers gleamed in the afternoon sunlight, while deep valleys disappeared into shadow between towering ridges. It was during this portion of the flight that Stardust encountered conditions that would prove fatal. High-altitude winds, poorly understood and unpredictably strong, began to affect the aircraft's ground speed. The jet stream, that fast river of air flowing from west to east, was stronger than forecast and positioned lower than expected. These high-altitude winds created headwinds that significantly reduced Stardust's ground speed without immediately alerting the crew to the problem. But the aircraft's airspeed, the speed through the air mass, remained normal, but her ground speed, the actual speed over the Earth's surface, was much slower than calculated. This phenomenon would have been invisible to the crew using the navigation methods of 1947. The aircraft felt normal, the engines were performing correctly, and the airspeed indicator showed expected values. Only a ground speed measurement, impossible without modern navigation equipment, would have revealed that Stardust was falling, behind her planned position. As the flight progressed, this navigation error compounded. Every few minutes that passed with slower than expected ground speed moved Stardust further behind her calculated position. The crew, believing they were making normal progress, continued to navigate using dead reckoning based on incorrect assumptions about their ground speed. Radio navigation aids became increasingly unreliable as Stardust flew deeper into the mountains. The high peaks blocked or distorted radio signals, making it impossible to get accurate bearing information from ground stations. The crew was forced to rely entirely on dead reckoning during the most critical portion of the flight. Cloud cover began to develop over the higher peaks, reducing visibility and making celestial navigation impossible. This was not unusual for afternoon flights over the Andes, where thermal heating often generated clouds and thunderstorms. However, it eliminated another potential source of navigation information at precisely the moment when accuracy was most important. At approximately 5:30 in the afternoon, Stardust should have been approaching the Chilean side of the Andes, beginning the descent toward Santiago. Based on their calculations, the crew believed they had cleared the highest peaks and could safely begin losing altitude. This was the most dangerous moment of any Andes crossing. The transition from high-altitude cruise to descent, when aircraft were most vulnerable to navigation errors. The crew's belief that they had cleared the mountains was based on dead reckoning, calculations that assumed normal ground speed throughout the flight. They had no way of knowing that strong headwinds had slowed their progress significantly, leaving them still over high terrain when they believed they were safely past it. 5:41 in the afternoon, radio operator Harmer transmitted what would become one of aviation's most famous messages. His high-frequency radio crackled to life with a transmission to Santiago approach control. ETA Santiago, 1745 hours STENDEC. The ground operator at Los Curios Airport received the message clearly, but was puzzled by the final word. STENDEC was not a recognized aviation code or abbreviation. He requested clarification, and Harmer repeated the word twice more before the transmission ended. Those were the last words ever heard from Stardust. The aircraft's estimated arrival time of 5:45 had come and gone. Los Curios Airport waited, but no silver aircraft appeared in the Chilean sky. Ground controllers attempted to re-establish radio contact, but their calls went unanswered. Stardust had simply vanished. As darkness fell over the Andes, the reality began to sink in. An aircraft carrying 11 people had disappeared without a trace over some of the world's most hostile terrain. The mystery of Stardust had begun, and with it, one of aviation's most enduring puzzles. What did that final word STENDEC mean? STENDEC. 7 letters transmitted in Morse code from a doomed aircraft high above the Andes Mountains. 7 letters that would puzzle investigators, amateur theorists, and aviation experts for over 50 years. 7 letters that would become synonymous with one of aviation's greatest mysteries. To understand the significance of this mysterious transmission, we must first understand the world of aviation communication in 1947. Radio contact between aircraft and ground stations was conducted entirely in Morse code, transmitted by high-frequency radio waves that could propagate over vast distances under the right atmospheric conditions. Radio operators like Dennis Harmer were skilled craftsmen of communication, able to send and receive Morse code at speeds that would challenge modern operators. Their rapid, staccato transmissions carried vital information: position reports, weather updates, fuel status, and estimated arrival times. The language was clipped and efficient, designed to convey maximum information in minimum time. Standard. Aviation abbreviations were well established and widely understood. ETA meant estimated time of arrival. HRS indicated hours. Position reports followed standardized formats that were familiar to operators around the world. The language of aviation was international, crossing linguistic barriers through the universal medium of dots and dashes. Against this background of standardized professional communication, the word STENDEC stands out like a shout in a library. It was not a recognized abbreviation, not a standard code word, not a term found in any aviation manual of the era. Yet it was transmitted clearly and deliberately, repeated twice when the ground operator requested clarification. The ground operator at Los Cerrillos Airport, Santiago, later described receiving the transmission. The signal was loud and clear, indicating good radio conditions and normal transmission power from Stardust. The message began routinely. ETA Santiago, 1745 hours. A standard arrival time report that would have prepared ground. Services for the aircraft's arrival. Then came the mysterious word, STENDEC. The ground operator, puzzled by this unfamiliar term, requested clarification. Standard procedure called for repeating any unclear portion of a message to ensure accurate communication. Harmer responded by repeating STENDEC twice more. Then the transmission ended. There were no further communications from Stardust. The clarity and deliberate nature of this transmission eliminated several potential explanations. This was not a garbled message distorted by poor radio conditions. It was not a partial transmission cut off by equipment failure. The word was sent clearly, 3 times, by an experienced operator who understood the importance of accurate communication. In the days and weeks following Stardust's disappearance, investigators and amateur theorists began proposing explanations for the mysterious word. The theories that emerged reflected the human need to make sense of the inexplicable, to find patterns and meaning in what might have been simply a tragic accident. The most popular theory suggested that STENDEC was an anagram of the word descent, scrambled either by transmission error or by an operator working under extreme stress. This theory had immediate appeal because it suggested a logical meaning. The aircraft was beginning its descent toward Santiago, exactly what would be expected at that point in the flight. Proponents of the anagram theory noted that all the letters of descent were present in STENDEC, requiring only a rearrangement to form the familiar word. They suggested that Harmer, possibly working under difficult conditions in an unpressurized cockpit at 24,000 feet, might have scrambled the letters while attempting to send a routine descent message. However, the anagram theory faced significant challenges. Experienced Morse operators noted that the patterns of dots and dashes for descent and STENDEC were completely different. An operator would have to make multiple specific errors to transform one word into the other, then repeat those same errors exactly when asked for clarification. Such a sequence of mistakes seemed unlikely for an operator of Harmer's experience and skill. Another theory suggested that STENDEC represented an abbreviation of a longer phrase, compressed in the rapid style often used by experienced Morse operators. Phrases like starting descent could theoretically be shortened to something resembling STENDEC if transmitted at high speed with certain letters elided or modified. Some investigators proposed that the mysterious word might be a misheard version of a legitimate aviation code. Radio signals could be affected by atmospheric conditions, and it was possible that Harmer had transmitted a recognized abbreviation that was distorted during reception. However, this theory was weakened by the fact that the ground operator requested and received exactly the same word 3 times. A more technical theory focused on the possibility of Morse code spacing errors. In Morse transmission, letters are separated by brief pauses and words by longer pauses. If these spacing intervals were incorrect, either due to operator error or equipment malfunction, a legitimate message could be misinterpreted as STENDEC, some. Experts suggested that STENDEC might represent a garbled version of SCTIAR, where SC could be an abbreviation for Santiago, Chile, TI might represent a time indicator, and AR was a standard Morse abbreviation meaning over or end of message. Under this theory, spacing errors could have run these separate elements together into the mysterious word. As the years passed and no definitive explanation emerged, more exotic theories began to appear. Some suggested that STENDEC was a secret, code word used for covert purposes, possibly related to the classified documents carried by the king's messenger. Others proposed that the transmission might have been made under duress, either from hijackers or as a result of some other emergency situation. The hypoxia theory gained some support from aviation medical experts. At 24,000 feet in an unpressurized aircraft, oxygen deprivation could affect cognitive function and motor coordination. It was possible that Harmer, despite having oxygen equipment available, might have been suffering from hypoxia, severe enough to affect his Morse transmission accuracy. However, the hypoxia theory faced the same challenge as other explanations. The word was transmitted clearly 3 times, and the rest of the message was perfectly formed. Hypoxia that affected only one word of a transmission seemed unlikely, particularly for an operator experienced in high-altitude flight. Some theorists focused on the psychological aspects of the transmission. They noted that Harmer would have been working under considerable stress, maintaining radio contact during a dangerous mountain crossing in an unpressurized aircraft. Stress could potentially affect cognitive function, leading to transmission errors that might not occur under normal conditions. The stress theory suggested that Harmer might have intended to send a standard message, but under pressure reverted to some personal mnemonic or code that had meaning for him but was meaningless to outside observers. This could explain why the word was repeated exactly 3 times. It had specific meaning for the operator, even if that meaning was not apparent to others. As the investigation progressed and no wreckage was found, some observers began to suggest more sinister explanations. The presence of classified diplomatic documents aboard the aircraft led to speculation about sabotage or hijacking. Could STENDEC have been a coded distress signal, indicating that the aircraft was under some form of external threat? This theory gained little support from professional investigators, who noted that the transmission sounded routine until the mysterious final word. There were no other indications of emergency or distress in the communication, and the estimated arrival time was given normally. If the aircraft were under attack or experiencing a serious emergency, more urgent language would be expected. The secrecy theory was further weakened by the fact that STENDEC was not found in any military or diplomatic codebook of the era. If it were indeed a secret distress signal, it would presumably appear in classified communication manuals, but extensive searches revealed no such reference. International appeals for theories brought hundreds of suggestions from amateur investigators and aviation enthusiasts. Proposed explanations range from plausible technical theories to elaborate conspiracy scenarios involving everything from experimental aircraft to extraterrestrial intervention. None achieved general acceptance among professional investigators. The British Broadcasting Corporation, recognizing public fascination with the mystery, conducted an extensive investigation for their Horizon program in the 1980s. They collected theories from viewers around the world, consulted with Morse code experts, and analyzed the technical aspects of the transmission in detail. The BBC investigation concluded that the most likely explanation involved Morse code spacing, or interpretation errors. They suggested that Harmer might have transmitted a legitimate message that was misunderstood due to the rapid transmission speed and the ground operator's unfamiliarity with non-standard abbreviations. However, even this careful analysis could not provide a definitive answer. The BBC investigators acknowledged that the mystery might never be completely solved, that STENDEC might remain forever an enigmatic footnote to aviation history. As decades passed without resolution, STENDEC took on a life of its own, becoming part of aviation folklore alongside other unsolved mysteries. The word appeared in books, documentaries, and magazine articles, always accompanied by the disclaimer that its meaning remained unknown. The enduring fascination with STENDEC reflected humanity's discomfort with unsolved puzzles. In an age of increasing scientific understanding and technological capability, the idea that a simple 7-letter word could remain incomprehensible seemed almost impossible to accept. Yet that word, transmitted from a doomed aircraft high above the Andes on an August afternoon in 1947, continued to resist explanation. It stood as a reminder that some mysteries might never be solved, that the past sometimes keeps its secrets despite our best efforts to unlock them. STENDEC became more than just a mysterious transmission. It became a symbol of the unknown, a reminder that even in our modern, interconnected world, there are still questions without answers, puzzles without solutions, mysteries that endure long after the events that created them have faded into history. The word would remain a puzzle until Stardust herself finally surrendered her secrets, emerging from the ice more than 50 years after she disappeared into the clouds above the Andes Mountains. When Stardust failed to appear at Santiago's Los Chorrillos airport at the expected time of 5:45 on the evening of August 2nd, 1947, the initial reaction was concern rather than panic. Aircraft were often delayed by weather, mechanical problems, or navigation difficulties. Controllers continued to attempt radio contact, calling repeatedly on the frequencies Stardust had been using. As minutes turned to hours with no response, concern gave way to alarm. By nightfall, it was clear that something serious had happened to the missing aircraft. Search and rescue operations began immediately, though the darkness and mountainous terrain made night searching extremely dangerous and largely ineffective. The scale of the search operation that began at dawn on August 3rd was unprecedented for its time. Both Chilean and Argentine authorities committed extensive resources to finding Stardust, understanding that 11 lives hung in the balance and that the reputation of commercial aviation itself was at stake. Air Vice Marshal Don Bennett, the legendary wartime Pathfinder leader who now headed BSAA operations, personally took charge of the search effort. Bennett was perhaps the most qualified person in the world to organize such an operation, having pioneered many of the navigation techniques used by long-range aircraft during World War II. Bennett understood the challenges facing the search. Teams. The Andes Mountains covered thousands of square miles of some of the world's most hostile terrain. Peaks rose above 22,000 feet, with deep valleys carved by ancient glaciers, creating countless places where an aircraft might have come down. Weather in the mountains could change from clear to violent storms within minutes, making search flights dangerous for the rescuers as well. The search operation was organized along scientific principles, dividing the probable search area into grid squares that could be systematically examined. Aircraft from both the Chilean and Argentine air forces joined the effort, supplemented by BSAA's own aircraft and civilian volunteers with suitable planes. Search aircraft flew predetermined patterns at various altitudes, their crews scanning the mountain terrain below for any sign of wreckage. They looked for the glint of metal against snow and rock, for the dark scar that a crash might leave on a mountainside, for any disturbance in the natural pattern of the landscape that might indicate an aircraft accident. Ground teams, where they could operate, followed a similar systematic approach. Military units and civilian volunteers combed accessible areas, particularly valleys and passes where an aircraft might have attempted an emergency landing. They searched for wreckage, for signs of survivors, for any clue that might explain what had happened to Stardust. The search effort was hampered by the extreme altitude and harsh weather conditions prevalent in the high Andes. Many search areas were above the service ceiling of available aircraft. While ground access was limited by treacherous terrain and the effects of altitude on human performance, international cooperation was remarkable for the era. Chilean and Argentine military forces worked together despite occasional political tensions between the two countries. British officials coordinated with South American authorities, sharing intelligence and resources in the common goal of finding the missing aircraft and her passengers. Weather proved to be a constant enemy of the search effort. The Andes generated their own weather systems, with storms appearing suddenly and creating conditions too dangerous for search aircraft. Visibility could drop to zero within minutes as clouds enveloped mountain peaks, forcing search planes to retreat to safer altitudes. After 5 days of intensive searching, Air Vice Marshal Bennett made the difficult decision to scale back the operation. Dozens of aircraft had flown hundreds of hours over the mountains, ground teams had covered every accessible area, and no trace of Stardust had been found. The harsh reality was that the aircraft appeared to have vanished completely. The failure to find any trace of the missing aircraft puzzled experienced search and rescue professionals. Modern aircraft, even when destroyed in crashes, typically left debris scattered over considerable areas. Metal fragments, fabric pieces, fuel stains, or personal belongings usually provided some indication of a crash site. Yet the mountains seemed to have swallowed Stardust without leaving any evidence of her fate. Several theories emerged to explain the complete absence of wreckage. Some suggested that Stardust might have crashed in a deep valley or crevasse where snow and ice quickly covered any debris. Others proposed that an explosion at altitude might have scattered wreckage over such a wide area that pieces were impossible to locate in the vast mountain wilderness. A more disturbing possibility was that Stardust had encountered such severe weather conditions that the aircraft had been completely destroyed, perhaps by extreme turbulence or lightning strike. Mountain flying in 1947 carried risks that were poorly understood, and it was possible that the aircraft had encountered conditions beyond the capability of any plane to survive. The families of the missing passengers and crew faced an agonizing wait as the search operation continued and then gradually wound down. Hope faded slowly as days passed without any discovery, but the absence of wreckage meant that some possibility of survival remained, however remote. False alarms added to the emotional strain. Amateur radio operators reported receiving weak SOS signals that might have come from Stardust. raising hopes that were inevitably dashed when the signals proved to be from other sources or atmospheric interference. Each false lead reopened wounds that were just beginning to heal. The psychological impact on families was severe and long-lasting. The uncertainty was in many ways worse than confirmed death would have been. Without bodies to bury or wreckage to examine, families were left in limbo, unable to fully grieve or to move forward with their lives. Mrs. Cook, widow of the captain, expressed the feelings of many when she said that the not knowing was the hardest part to bear. She could accept that her husband had died. Aviation was a dangerous profession, and military service had taught her to live with risk. But the complete absence of information made it impossible to find closure. The King's Messenger Service faced particular difficulties because of the classified documents that Paul Simpson had been carrying. Officials needed to determine whether the diplomatic pouch might have survived and fallen into unauthorized hands, requiring a delicate investigation that could not be discussed publicly. As weeks turned to months and months to years, the immediate urgency of the search faded, but questions remained. The missing aircraft became part of aviation folklore, discussed in flying clubs and investigated by amateur researchers. Books were written proposing various theories about what might have happened to Stardust. The failure to find any trace of the aircraft had broader implications for aviation safety. If aircraft could simply vanish without leaving any evidence, how could investigators learn from accidents and improve safety procedures? The Stardust case highlighted the limitations of search and rescue capabilities in remote areas and spurred development of better emergency location systems. BSAA continued operations over the Andes crossing, but with heightened attention to safety procedures. The airline could not afford to have its reputation damaged by mysterious disappearances, particularly when other carriers were beginning to offer competing services on the South American routes. The search for Stardust established precedents for international cooperation in aviation emergencies that would prove valuable in future incidents. The willingness of Chilean and Argentine authorities to work together, despite political differences, demonstrated that aviation safety transcended national boundaries. Professional search and rescue personnel studied the Stardust case carefully, learning lessons about organizing searches in hostile terrain and maintaining operations over extended periods. The systematic approach pioneered by Air Vice Marshal Bennett became a model for future search operations. Weather services began paying more attention to high-altitude wind patterns after the Stardust incident. The possibility that unexpected jet stream conditions had contributed to the aircraft's disappearance led to improved weather reporting and forecasting for high-altitude flights. As the 1940s gave way to the 1950s, Stardust gradually faded from the headlines, though not from memory. The aircraft and her passengers joined the ranks of aviation's unsolved mysteries, along with other famous disappearances like Amelia Earhart and Glenn Miller. The case remained officially open, though active investigation had ceased. Occasionally, reports would surface of wreckage sighted in remote mountain areas, leading to brief renewed interest, but these always proved to be false alarms or unrelated debris. Families eventually received death certificates and settled estates, though the legal process was complicated by the absence of bodies or wreckage. Insurance companies paid claims, but the case remained a subject of dispute and speculation within the aviation industry. The Andes Mountains kept their secret well, giving no hint of what had happened to Stardust and her 11 souls. Snow continued to fall on the high peaks. Glaciers crept slowly down valleys carved by ancient ice, and the passage of seasons gradually erased any surface evidence of human presence. Yet somewhere in those vast, hostile mountains, the truth waited patiently for discovery. The ice that had hidden Stardust's fate would not keep its secret forever. Time and the slow movement of glaciers would eventually reveal what had happened on that August afternoon in 1947, but it would take more than 50 years for the mountains to give up their dead. The disappearance of Stardust was not an isolated incident in the brief but turbulent history of British South American Airways. Within 2 years of the Andes Mountains tragedy, 2 more BSAA aircraft would vanish without a trace, creating a pattern of losses that would doom the airline and add to aviation's collection of unsolved mysteries. The second disappearance occurred on January 30th, 1948, less than 6 months after Stardust vanished. The aircraft was Star Tiger, an Avro Tudor 4, registration GAHNP, operating a passenger service from London to Havana via the Azores and Bermuda. Like Stardust, she would simply vanish, leaving behind only questions and theories. Star Tiger's final flight began routinely enough at London Airport. The Tudor R4 was a larger aircraft than the Lancastrian that had become Stardust, capable of carrying more passengers over longer distances. The flight plan called for stops in Lisbon, the Azores, and Bermuda before continuing to Havana, following established routes that BSAA had been operating successfully for nearly 2 years. The first 2 legs of the journey proceeded normally. Star Tiger reached the Azores on schedule, refueled, and prepared for the overwater flight to Bermuda. This segment would take the aircraft across nearly 800 miles of open Atlantic Ocean, well beyond the range of land-based navigation. aids and entirely dependent on dead reckoning for position fixing. Weather conditions for the Atlantic crossing were marginal but acceptable. Headwinds were stronger than forecast, which would increase flight time and fuel consumption, but not beyond the aircraft's capability. The crew was experienced in long-range overwater flying, and the Tudor 4 was equipped with the best navigation equipment available in 1948. Star Tiger departed Santa Maria in the Azores at 23:15 hours on January 29th, carrying 25 passengers and 6 crew members. The passenger list included business travelers, military personnel, and civilians traveling between Europe and the Americas. Among them were several women and children, making the flight a cross-section of post-war international travelers. Regular position reports during the first part of the flight indicated normal progress. Star Tiger was maintaining course and altitude. Fuel consumption was within acceptable limits, and the crew reported no problems with aircraft systems. The flight appeared to be proceeding as routinely as thousands of others that had crossed the Atlantic since the war's end. The last confirmed radio contact with Star Tiger came at 03:50 hours on January 30th, when the aircraft reported her position as approximately 400 miles northeast of Bermuda. This transmission was routine, giving position, altitude, and estimated time of arrival at Bermuda. Nothing in the crew's voice suggested any problem or concern. After that transmission, Star Tiger simply vanished. The aircraft failed to arrive at Bermuda at her estimated time, and all attempts to re-establish radio contact proved unsuccessful. Search aircraft launched from Bermuda found no trace of the missing Tudor, despite flying extensive patterns over her projected route. The disappearance of Star Tiger was eerily similar to that of Stardust 7 months earlier. Both aircraft had vanished during critical phases of flight. Stardust over mountains, Star Tiger over open ocean. Both had made routine radio transmissions shortly before disappearing. Both had experienced crews and properly maintained aircraft, and both had left no trace of their fate. The search for Star Tiger was extensive and well organized, benefiting from lessons learned during the Stardust operation. United States Air Force units joined British and Bermuda-based aircraft in combing the western Atlantic for any sign of the missing Tudor. 26 aircraft flew 882 hours over 5 days, covering thousands of square miles of ocean. Despite the intensive search effort, no trace of Star Tiger was ever found. No wreckage, no oil slicks, no personal effects, nothing to indicate what had happened to the aircraft, and 31 people aboard. The Atlantic Ocean had proved as effective at concealing evidence as the Andes Mountains. The loss of Star Tiger had immediate consequences for BSAA operations. All Tudor aircraft were grounded pending a thorough investigation of the type's airworthiness. The airline's reputation, already damaged by the Stardust disappearance, suffered another severe blow as passengers began to question the safety of BSAA services. Investigators examining the Star Tiger case faced the same frustrating lack of evidence that had plagued the Stardust investigation. Without wreckage or witnesses, they could only speculate about what might have caused the aircraft to vanish. Whether mechanical failure, navigation error, or structural failure were all possibilities, but none could be proven. The Tudor 4 had a controversial service history that added to concerns about its safety. The aircraft had been designed during World War II as a long-range transport, but development problems had delayed its entry into service. Early production, aircraft had experienced various technical problems, leading to modifications and improvements that had not been fully proven in service. Some investigators suggested that Star Tiger might have suffered a catastrophic structural failure that caused the aircraft to break up in flight. The Tudor's pressure cabin was an advanced feature for its time, but the stresses of pressurization and depressurization could potentially lead to metal fatigue failures that were poorly understood in 1948. Others proposed that the aircraft might have encountered severe weather conditions that overwhelmed its structural limits. The Atlantic in winter could generate storms of extraordinary violence, with turbulence severe enough to destroy even large aircraft. If Star Tiger had flown into such conditions, the results could have been catastrophic. Navigation error remained another possibility. If the aircraft had become lost due to instrument failure or crew error, fuel exhaustion could have forced a ditching in the open ocean. Aircraft of that era were not designed to survive water landings, and survival in the winter Atlantic would be measured in minutes rather than hours. The investigation into Star Tiger's disappearance was thorough, but ultimately inconclusive. Without physical evidence, investigators could not determine the cause of the loss or recommend specific safety improvements. The aircraft had simply vanished, taking her secrets to the bottom of the Atlantic. Before the aviation industry could fully absorb the implications of losing 2 aircraft without trace, BSAA suffered a third mysterious disappearance. On January 17, 1949, almost exactly 1 year after Star Tiger vanished, another Tudor 4 would follow her sister aircraft into oblivion. Star Ariel, registration GAGRE, was operating a service from London to Santiago, via intermediate stops when she disappeared between Bermuda and Jamaica. The aircraft had been substituted for another Tudor that had developed engine problems, a last-minute change that may have been prophetic. Star Ariel's disappearance was even more puzzling than her predecessors, because it occurred in perfect flying weather over a well-established route. The aircraft took off from Bermuda at 8:41 in the morning local time, carrying 13 passengers and 7 crew members. Weather conditions were excellent, with unlimited visibility and light winds. The flight was expected to be routine, following a path that BSAA aircraft had flown successfully many times before. Jamaica was only a few hours away, and the route passed over numerous islands where emergency landings would be possible if problems developed. Radio contact with Star Ariel continued normally for almost an hour after departure. The crew reported routine progress at their 1-hour position, giving their location as 57 miles south-southwest of Bermuda at 18,000 feet altitude. This transmission was received clearly and gave no indication of any problem. That was the last anyone ever heard from Star Ariel. When the aircraft failed to arrive at Kingston, Jamaica at her scheduled time, search operations began immediately. The proximity of multiple islands and the good weather conditions initially gave searchers hope that Star Ariel might have made an emergency landing on some remote airstrip or beach. The search area was smaller and more accessible than those faced in the previous BSAA disappearances. Ships and aircraft from multiple nations joined the operation, systematically examining every island and stretch of water along the aircraft's route. Weather remained favorable throughout the search period, eliminating the visibility problems that had hampered earlier operations. Yet once again, no trace of the missing aircraft was found. Star Ariel had vanished as completely as her sister. Ships leaving behind no wreckage, no survivors, no clues to her fate. The Caribbean Sea had joined the Andes Mountains and the Atlantic Ocean in concealing the evidence of aviation disasters. The loss of 3 aircraft without trace in less than 2 years was unprecedented in commercial aviation history. BSAA's safety record, which had been exemplary in the airline's early operations, was now permanently tarnished. Public confidence in the airline plummeted, and bookings dropped dramatically as passengers sought alternative carriers. Government investigators launched comprehensive reviews of BSAA operations, examining everything from maintenance procedures to crew training to route planning. The Tudor aircraft type came under particular scrutiny, with experts questioning whether fundamental design flaws might be responsible for the disappearances. The investigation revealed that the Tudor R4 had experienced various technical problems throughout its development and early service life. Pressurization system failures, engine problems, and control difficulties had all been reported, though none had been directly linked to the disappearances. The aircraft's complex systems and advanced design may have made it more susceptible to catastrophic failures than simpler aircraft types. More disturbing was the discovery of similarities among the 3 disappearances. All had occurred during cruise flight in apparently normal conditions. All had ended with routine radio transmissions, followed by complete silence. All had left no trace despite extensive search operations. The pattern suggested a common cause, though investigators could not determine what that might be. Theories proliferated as aviation experts and amateur investigators attempted to explain the unprecedented series of losses. Some focused on technical explanations, structural failures, explosive decompression, or electrical system malfunctions that could disable an aircraft so completely that no distress signal could be transmitted. Others proposed more exotic theories, involving unusual weather phenomena, magnetic anomalies, or even deliberate sabotage. The fact that all 3 aircraft had carried passengers and cargo of potential strategic value led to speculation about enemy action, though no evidence supported such theories. The psychological impact of the disappearances extended far beyond BSAA and its immediate stakeholders. The aviation industry as a whole faced questions about the safety of commercial flight, particularly over remote areas where search and rescue operations were difficult or impossible. Insurance companies began reassessing the risks associated with commercial aviation, leading to higher premiums and more stringent safety requirements. Aircraft manufacturers faced increased scrutiny of their designs, while airlines found themselves subject to more comprehensive regulatory oversight. The traveling public's confidence in air transportation was shaken by the mysterious disappearances. If aircraft could simply vanish without explanation, carrying their passengers to unknown fates, how safe was commercial aviation? The romance of flight was overshadowed by the reality that modern transportation still carried significant risks. SAA's response to the crisis was swift, but ultimately insufficient. The airline grounded its entire Tudor fleet, replacing them with more conventional aircraft types that had proven service records. Routes were reviewed and modified to avoid areas where search and rescue operations would be difficult. However, the damage to BSAA's reputation was irreversible. The airline had lost 3 aircraft and 66 lives in less than 2 years, creating a safety record that no amount of procedural changes could overcome. Passenger bookings continued to decline as travelers chose alternative carriers with better safety reputations. The British government, recognizing that BSAA could not survive as an independent entity, began negotiations to merge the airline with the larger and more stable British Overseas Airways Corporation. This merger was completed on April 1st, 1950, effectively ending BSAA's existence as a separate airline. The disappearance of 3 BSAA aircraft without trace remains one of commercial aviation's greatest unsolved mysteries. Despite decades of investigation and speculation, no definitive explanation has ever been found for the loss of Stardust, Star Tiger, and Star Ariel. The cases remain open, though active investigation ceased long ago. The legacy of these mysterious disappearances extends beyond their immediate impact on BSAA and commercial aviation. They demonstrated the need for better emergency location systems, improved search and rescue capabilities, and more comprehensive accident investigation procedures. Many of the safety systems used in modern aviation can trace their origins to lessons learned from these tragic losses. Yet the fundamental mystery remains unsolved. 3 aircraft, carrying a total of 88 souls, vanished without leaving any trace of their fate. They became part of aviation folklore, joining other famous disappearances in the pantheon of unsolved mysteries that continue to fascinate and perplex observers decades after the events occurred. The pattern of the BSAA disappearances, routine, flights ending in complete vanishing, would be repeated occasionally in aviation history, though never with such devastating effect on a single airline. Each new case would revive interest in the earlier mysteries, leading to fresh theories and speculation about what might have caused such complete disappearances. Modern aviation, with its sophisticated navigation systems, comprehensive radar coverage, and mandatory emergency locator transmitters, has largely eliminated the possibility of aircraft vanishing without trace. Yet the BSAA cases serve as reminders of an earlier era when flying remained an adventure fraught with unknown dangers and unexplained phenomena. The mountains, oceans, and skies that claimed Stardust, Star Tiger, and Star Ariel kept their secrets well. Only Stardust would eventually surrender her mystery to the slow revelation of time and ice, leaving her sister ships to rest in unknown graves, their final moments forever shrouded in the mists of aviation history. To understand how Stardust could vanish so completely in 1947 and then reappear 50 years later, we must explore the remarkable science of glacial preservation and the unique characteristics of the high Andes environment where the aircraft met its fate. Glaciers are among nature's most powerful forces, capable of carving valleys, moving massive boulders, and preserving objects for centuries or millennia. They form in regions where more snow falls than melts, creating accumulations that gradually transform from snow to firn to glacial ice through a process that can take decades or centuries. The Andes Mountains create ideal conditions for glacier formation. At high altitudes, temperatures remain below freezing year-round, while moisture-laden air masses from the Pacific Ocean deposit heavy snow loads on the western slopes. These conditions have created some of South America's most extensive glacial systems, including the glaciers that would eventually reveal Stardust's secrets. Mount Tupungato, where Stardust's remains would eventually be discovered, rises to 22,310 feet above sea level, straddling the border between Argentina and Chile. The mountain is classified as a stratovolcano, though it has been inactive in recorded history. Its high altitude and position in the path of Pacific storm systems make it an ideal location for glacial formation and preservation. The glaciers of Mount Tupungato are part of a complex system that provides crucial water resources for millions of people in the region. During dry years, as much as 2/3 of the Maipo River's summer flow comes from glacial melt, supporting agriculture and urban water supplies as far away as Santiago. This makes the Tupungato glacial system not just scientifically interesting, but economically vital to the region. When Stardust struck the mountain on that August afternoon in 1947, she encountered a steep névé field, a transitional zone between fresh snow and glacial ice. At an altitude of approximately 15,000 feet, the impact site was well within the accumulation zone of the glacier, where annual snowfall exceeds annual melting. The physics of the impact would have been catastrophic. An aircraft traveling at nearly 200 miles per hour, weighing several tons, striking a snowfield as hard as concrete, would have resulted in instant, complete destruction. The aircraft would have been torn apart by forces far exceeding anything it was designed to withstand. But what happened next was even more remarkable than the impact itself. The collision with the steep snowfield almost certainly triggered an avalanche, one of nature's most destructive forces. Thousands of tons of snow would have cascaded down the mountainside, burying the wreckage within seconds and creating a tomb that would preserve Stardust's remains for half a century. Avalanches in the high Andes can be triggered by remarkably small disturbances. The impact of a large aircraft would have released far more energy than needed to start a massive snowslide. The avalanche would have buried the wreckage under tens or even hundreds of feet of snow, making it invisible to search aircraft flying overhead just days after the crash. The preservation process that followed was gradual but inexorable. Each winter brought new snow loads, adding weight and depth to the burial site. Summer melting was minimal at such high altitude, allowing the snow to accumulate year after year. Gradually, the increasing weight transformed the burial medium from snow to fern, then to glacial ice. Glacial ice is an extraordinary preservative medium. Unlike snow, which contains significant amounts of air and can shift or sublime away, glacial ice is dense, stable, and virtually impermeable. Objects frozen in glacial ice can remain unchanged for centuries, protected from oxidation, decay, and most forms of degradation. The pressure within a glacier system also contributes to preservation. As more ice accumulates above, the pressure increases, further compacting the medium and creating an environment where even delicate organic materials can survive indefinitely. Glacial ice has preserved everything from ancient insects to complete mammoths, keeping them in near-perfect condition for thousands of years. But glaciers are not static systems. They move. The ice that buried Stardust in 1947 began a slow journey down the mountainside, carrying the wreckage with it. Glacier movement is typically measured in meters per year rather than miles, but over decades this slow transport can carry objects considerable distances from their original burial sites. The mechanics of glacier movement are complex, involving both internal deformation of the ice and sliding over the underlying bedrock. In the case of the Tupungato Glacier system, the ice moved generally eastward and downward, following the natural drainage patterns of the mountain. Stardust's remains, entombed in ice, became part of this slow-motion river. Climate change began to affect the Tupungato Glacier system during the latter half of the 20th century. Rising temperatures caused increased melting rates, particularly at lower elevations where the glacier terminated. This accelerated melting had the unintended consequence of gradually exposing objects that had been buried for decades. The process by which glacial ice releases preserved objects is called ablation, the removal of ice through melting, sublimation, or mechanical processes. In the case of Stardust, ablation gradually brought pieces of the wreckage closer to the surface, where they could eventually be spotted by observant climbers or researchers. The first pieces of stardust to emerge from the ice were probably small fragments, bits of aluminum, fabric, or other materials that had been scattered during the initial impact. These early emergences may have occurred years or even decades before the major discoveries of the 1990s, but they would have been easily overlooked in the vast, harsh environment of the high Andes. The preservation quality achieved by the Tupungato Glacier system was extraordinary. When pieces of stardust began emerging from the ice in the late 20th century, many showed remarkably little deterioration, despite having been buried for over 50 years. Metal components retained their original finish, fabric pieces were still recognizable, and even rubber components like tires showed minimal degradation. This level of preservation was possible because of the unique conditions within the glacier. The constant sub-zero temperatures prevented chemical reactions that caused decay, while the absence of oxygen eliminated oxidation processes. The stable environment within the ice protected materials from the temperature fluctuations, moisture, variations, and ultraviolet radiation that caused degradation in normal conditions. The discovery of STAR. Dust's remains also provided valuable scientific information about glacier behavior and climate change in the Andes. By studying the location and condition of the wreckage pieces, glaciologists could infer details about ice movement rates, preservation, conditions, and the effects of changing climate on glacial systems. Modern climate research has shown that Andean glaciers are retreating rapidly due to global warming. The Tupungato Glacier system has lost significant mass over the past several decades, with some estimates suggesting that many Andean glaciers could disappear entirely within the next century. This retreat is not only releasing long-buried objects like stardust remains, but also threatening the water supplies of millions of people who depend on glacial melt. The scientific value of Stardust's remains extended beyond their historical significance. The aircraft served as an unintentional time capsule, preserving materials and conditions from 1947 in a form that allowed detailed analysis decades later. This provided unique insights into the manufacturing techniques, material composition, and construction methods of that era. Metallurgical analysis of Stardust's aluminum components revealed information about alloy composition and manufacturing, processes used in 1940s aircraft production. This data was valuable not only for historical research, but also for understanding the long-term durability of various materials under extreme preservation conditions. The fabric components recovered from Stardust provided similar insights into textile manufacturing of the era. Despite 50 years of burial in glacial ice, many fabric samples retained sufficient integrity to allow detailed fiber analysis and determination of weaving patterns and chemical composition. Perhaps most remarkably, human remains recovered from The crash site were also well preserved by the glacial environment. This preservation allowed DNA analysis that would have been impossible with remains exposed to normal environmental conditions for such an extended period. The successful identification of several victims through DNA matching represented a triumph of modern forensic science applied to historical mysteries. The Stardust case demonstrated the potential for glacial systems to preserve evidence of historical events, sometimes for far longer than initially expected. This has implications not only for aviation archaeology, but also for climate research, archaeological studies, and forensic investigations in glaciated regions. The gradual revelation of Stardust's remains also illustrated the dynamic nature of glacier systems and their response to climate change. The timing of the discoveries, beginning in the late 20th century, corresponded with accelerated glacial retreat due to global warming. In a sense, climate change was responsible for finally solving one of aviation's greatest mysteries. Understanding. The science behind Stardust's preservation and eventual discovery provides insight into similar cases, where objects or remains might be preserved in glacial environments. As climate change continues to cause glacier retreat worldwide, it's likely that other long-lost artifacts, crash sites, or even human remains will emerge from the ice in coming decades. The case also highlights the importance of glacial systems as natural archives, preserving information about past environmental conditions, human activities, and natural events. As these systems disappear due to climate change, we lose not only crucial water resources, but also irreplaceable records of the past. Stardust's long sleep in the ice of Mount Tupungato represents one of the most dramatic examples of glacial preservation in aviation history. The aircraft's remains, perfectly preserved by 50 years in the deep freeze of an Andean glacier, provided answers to questions that had puzzled investigators for half a century and demonstrated the remarkable power of ice to preserve the past, for future generations to discover. For 51 years, the families of Stardust's passengers and crew lived with uncertainty. Unlike most aviation accidents, where wreckage provides closure and answers, the complete disappearance of the aircraft left loved ones in a peculiar form of limbo, unable to fully grieve, yet unable to hope for survival. Mrs. Reginald Cook, widow of Stardust's captain, faced the particular burden that comes with being married to someone in a dangerous profession. Military wives during World War II had learned to live with the constant possibility of loss, but the peacetime disappearance of her husband seemed somehow more cruel than death in combat. At least in war, there were witnesses, comrades who could describe final moments and provide some measure of understanding. The absence of any explanation for Stardust's disappearance made the grieving process extraordinarily difficult. Without a body to bury, without wreckage to examine, without witnesses to interview, families were left to imagine what might have happened in those final moments above the Andes. Some found comfort in believing that death had been instantaneous, that their loved ones had felt no fear or pain. Others tormented themselves with thoughts of a slow crash, survival in impossible conditions, or worse. The legal complications of the disappearance added practical difficulties to emotional trauma. Insurance companies were reluctant to pay claims without proof of death, leading to lengthy disputes that kept families in financial uncertainty for months or years. Death certificates could not be issued without evidence, leaving estates in legal limbo and preventing survivors from moving forward with their lives. Mrs. Marta Limpert's family in Chile faced the additional tragedy of knowing that she had been carrying her husband's ashes, hoping to lay him to rest in their adopted homeland. The disappearance meant that both husband and wife had vanished, leaving no grave for family members to visit, no place where they could feel close to their lost loved ones. The families of the business travelers, Jack Gooderham, Peter Young, Harold Pogg, dealt with the sudden disruption of commercial enterprises and professional relationships. These men had been pursuing opportunities in South America, building the international connections that would define the post-war global economy. Their disappearance left business deals uncompleted, partnerships unformed, and economic opportunities unexplored. Paul Simpson's work as a king's messenger added a layer of official secrecy to his family's grief. The classified nature of his mission meant that relatives could not be told exactly what he had been doing or where he had been going. Government officials expressed sympathy but could provide few details, leaving family members to wonder whether official duties had somehow contributed to their loved one's fate. As months turned to years without any discovery, families gradually accepted that their missing relatives were dead, though the absence of proof made this acceptance incomplete. Memorial services were held, obituaries were published, and life gradually resumed its patterns. Yet always in the background remained the questions. What happened? Where are they? Will we ever know? Some family members became amateur investigators, corresponding with aviation experts, studying maps of the Andes, and proposing theories about what might have caused Stardust to vanish. They found comfort in the search for understanding, feeling that their efforts somehow honored the memory of their missing loved ones. The mystery attracted attention from writers, journalists, and documentary filmmakers who saw in Stardust's disappearance a perfect combination of human drama and unsolved puzzle. Books were written proposing various theories, magazine articles explored possible explanations, and television programs examined the evidence. Each new treatment of the story brought brief, renewed hope to families that answers might finally be found. Aviation enthusiasts and amateur investigators adopted the Stardust case as a personal challenge, spending countless hours analyzing flight paths, weather records, and radio transcripts. Internet forums and aviation magazines regularly featured new theories about the mysterious final word STENDEC, and speculations about what might have caused the aircraft to vanish so completely. The case became part of aviation folklore discussed in flying clubs and training academies as an example of how quickly routine flights could turn into disasters. Pilots flying over the Andes sometimes mentioned Stardust in their conversations, using the story as a reminder of the respect that mountains demanded from all who challenged them. Professional investigators periodically reviewed the case, hoping that new technologies or analytical techniques might reveal clues that had been missed in the original investigation. Advances in meteorology led to better understanding of high-altitude wind patterns, while improvements in search and rescue techniques raised questions about whether the original search had been adequate. The development of satellite navigation systems in the latter decades of the 20th century highlighted how primitive the navigation techniques available to Stardust had been. Modern GPS receivers could provide position accuracy within meters, while Stardust's crew had been forced to rely on dead reckoning and radio beacons that could be off by miles under adverse conditions. Weather research revealed new information about jet stream behavior and mountain wave effects that might have contributed to Stardust's fate. Scientists studying high-altitude atmospheric phenomena found that wind speeds and directions at cruising altitudes could vary dramatically from surface forecasts, potentially creating navigation errors that would have been invisible to crews. Using 1940s technology, as the 50th anniversary of the disappearance approached in 1997, renewed media attention focused on the case. Television documentaries re-examined the evidence, newspaper articles summarized the various theories, and internet discussion groups debated the merits of different explanations for the mystery. Some family members who had been children when Stardust disappeared were now approaching old age themselves. The passage of time had healed many wounds, but it had also created a sense of urgency. If answers were ever to be found, time was running out for the generation that remembered the missing passengers and crew as living people rather than historical figures. The development of DNA analysis techniques offered new possibilities for identifying remains, should any ever be found. This technology, unavailable in 1947, could potentially identify victims from small tissue samples that might have survived decades of burial in harsh mountain conditions. Advances in remote sensing and satellite imagery raised hopes that wreckage might be spotted from space, even if it was located in areas too remote or dangerous for ground-based searches. High-resolution satellite photographs could reveal details of terrain that had been invisible to search aircraft in 1947, potentially uncovering clues that had been overlooked for decades. The case attracted attention from paranormal investigators and conspiracy theorists who proposed increasingly exotic explanations for the disappearance. UFO enthusiasts suggested alien abduction, while others proposed secret military experiments or government cover-ups. These theories, while unsupported by evidence, reflected the human need to find explanations for inexplicable events. More conventional researchers focused on the technical aspects of the case, analyzing everything from radio propagation patterns to aircraft structural limits. They hoped that advances in engineering and physics might reveal failure modes or environmental conditions that had not been understood in 1947. The mystery of STENDEC continued to generate particular fascination, with new theories proposed regularly in aviation magazines and internet forums. Linguists, cryptographers, and radio operators all offered interpretations of the mysterious final word, though none achieved general acceptance among experts. International cooperation in aviation had improved dramatically since 1947, raising possibilities that a coordinated multinational investigation might uncover evidence that had been missed by the original search efforts. Modern search and rescue techniques, including helicopter operations at high altitude and specialized mountain rescue teams, could explore areas that had been inaccessible to 1940s technology. Climate change and glacier retreat in the Andes began to generate speculation that objects buried in ice might eventually be revealed as glaciers melted and retreated. Scientists studying glacial systems noted that warming temperatures were causing significant changes in high-altitude ice formations, potentially exposing materials that had been buried for decades. This possibility seemed remote to most observers. The Andes covered thousands of square miles of hostile terrain, and the chance of finding wreckage from a single aircraft seemed astronomically small. Yet the idea persisted that somewhere in those vast mountains, Stardust's remains were waiting for discovery. Family members gradually passed away, taking with them personal memories of the missing passengers and crew. Children who had waited for parents to return home eventually became grandparents themselves, keeping alive family stories about relatives who had vanished into the South American sky. The case remained officially open in various jurisdictions, though active investigation had long since ceased. File folders in aviation offices gathered dust containing witness statements, weather reports, and search records that documented one of history's most thorough investigations into an unsolved disappearance. Yet the mountains themselves remained unchanged, keeping their secrets locked in ice and stone. Somewhere in the vast wilderness of the high Andes, the truth about stardust waited patiently for the slow processes of geological time to reveal what human investigation could not discover. The families who had waited so long for answers could not have imagined that their patience would eventually be rewarded, that the ice itself would finally surrender the evidence that had been hidden for more than half a century. The mountains had kept their secret well, but they would not keep it forever. January 15th, 1998, dawned clear and cold on the slopes of Mount Tupungato. Two Argentine mountaineers, seeking to explore the remote high-altitude regions of the Andes, were climbing at approximately 15,000 feet when something unusual caught their eye. Amid the endless expanse of snow and ice, geometric shapes that clearly were not natural protruded from a steep glacier field. The climbers, experienced in high-altitude mountaineering, immediately recognized that they had discovered something significant. The twisted metal fragments, the geometric angles cutting through organic mountain curves, and the unmistakable industrial character of the debris could mean only one thing. They had found the remains of an aircraft, what they could not have known. At that moment was that they had discovered one of aviation's most famous missing aircraft. The debris field scattered across the glacier contained the remains of Stardust, the Avro-Lancastrian, that had vanished without trace 50 years. 5 months and 13 days earlier, the location of the discovery was startling. The wreckage lay on the eastern Argentine side of the Continental Divide, more than 50 miles from Santiago, Chile, Stardust's intended destination. The aircraft had come to rest at an altitude of approximately 15,000 feet, well, above the tree line, in an area of permanent snow and ice where few humans ever ventured. The climbers, understanding the potential significance of their discovery, carefully documented what they could see and photographed the visible debris. They noted pieces of twisted aluminum, fragments of fabric, and what appeared to be parts of aircraft engines. The debris was widely scattered across the glacier, suggesting a high-speed impact that had torn the aircraft apart on contact with the mountain. News of the discovery spread slowly through mountaineering circles before reaching aviation authorities and the international media. For the first time in over 50 years, there was concrete evidence of Stardust's fate. The long wait was finally over, at least partially. However, the extreme altitude and remoteness of the crash site presented enormous challenges for any detailed investigation. The wreckage lay in an area accessible only to experienced high altitude. Climbers and the harsh conditions limited the time that could be spent examining the debris. Weather on Mount Tupungato could change from calm to life-threatening within minutes, making extended stays at the crash site extremely dangerous. Initial examination of the visible wreckage provided some immediate insights into Stardust's final moments. The debris pattern suggested a high-speed impact with steep terrain, consistent with an aircraft flying into a mountain in conditions of poor visibility. There was no evidence of fire or explosion prior to impact. The damage appeared to result entirely from the collision with the mountain. Pieces of Rolls-Royce Merlin engine were clearly visible among the debris, confirming that this was indeed an Avro-Lancastrian rather than some other aircraft type. The presence of multiple engine components scattered across a wide area indicated that all 4 of Stardust's engines had been torn from their mounts during the impact sequence. Perhaps most remarkably, some components showed extraordinary preservation due to their 50-year entombment in glacial ice. Metal parts retained much of their original finish. Fabric fragments were still recognizable, and even rubber components showed minimal deterioration. The glacier had functioned as a deep freeze, protecting the wreckage from the normal processes of decay and degradation. The discovery answered some questions about Stardust's disappearance while raising others. The location of the crash site, far from the aircraft's intended flight path, suggested that navigation errors had played a role in the accident. But how had an experienced crew become so far off course? And what had caused them to descend into terrain when they should have been safely above the mountains? Argentine authorities, recognizing the international significance of the discovery, began planning a formal recovery expedition. The operation would require specialized high-altitude equipment, experienced mountain rescue personnel, and careful coordination to work safely in the harsh environment of the crash site. The families of Stardust's passengers and crew received the news of the discovery with mixed emotions. After more than 50 years of uncertainty, there was finally proof of their loved one's fate. Yet the confirmation of death, even after so many decades, reopened wounds that had slowly healed over time. Mrs. Cook had passed away years earlier, never knowing what had happened to her husband. However, other family members remained alive to witness the revelation of Stardust's secrets. For them, the discovery brought a complex mix of closure and renewed grief as they finally learned the truth about events that had occurred more than half a century earlier. The international media seized upon the story, recognizing the dramatics, elements of mystery solved and secrets revealed. Newspapers around the world carried accounts of the discovery, often accompanied by historical photographs of Stardust and her crew. Television documentaries began production, eager to tell the complete story of the aircraft's disappearance and eventual discovery. Aviation historians and accident investigators expressed fascination with the case, noting that few accidents had remained unsolved for so long before yielding their secrets. The Stardust case represented a unique opportunity to examine a vintage aircraft accident with modern investigative techniques, potentially providing insights that had been impossible in 1947. Preliminary examination of the wreckage site revealed that the aircraft had struck the mountain at a shallow angle while flying at near cruise speed. The evidence suggested controlled flight into terrain rather than a violent upset or structural failure. This finding supported theories that navigation error had caused the crew to descend while still over high ground. The scattered nature of the debris indicated that the impact had been catastrophic, with the aircraft breaking apart almost instantly upon striking the mountain. Given the violence of the collision, death would have been instantaneous for all aboard, a small comfort for family members who had wondered for decades whether their loved ones might have suffered. Weather conditions at the time of the original accident became a focus of renewed investigation. Researchers examining historical meteorological records found evidence of significant high-altitude wind activity over the Andes on August 2, 1947. These conditions could have created the headwinds that slowed Stardust's progress without the crew's knowledge. The mystery of the final radio transmission, STENDEC, remained unsolved despite the discovery of the wreckage. The crash site provided no additional clues about what radio operator Dennis Harmer had been trying to communicate in those final moments. The word remained an enigma, as puzzling as ever despite the revelation of the aircraft's ultimate fate. Plans for a comprehensive recovery expedition began to take shape as Argentine authorities worked with international aviation organizations to organize a proper investigation. The operation would need to overcome significant logistical challenges, transporting equipment to 15,000 feet altitude, working in sub-zero temperatures, and dealing with the unpredictable weather conditions typical of high mountain environments. The discovery site itself presented unique preservation challenges. The debris had remained stable for 50 years in the ice, but exposure to air and temperature fluctuations could accelerate deterioration of the wreckage and any human remains. Recovery operations would need to work quickly to preserve evidence and treat human remains with appropriate dignity. International cooperation in the recovery effort reflected the global nature of the original tragedy. British aviation authorities offered technical expertise, Chilean officials provided logistical support, and Argentine military units committed personnel and equipment to the challenging operation. The spirit of cooperation demonstrated that aviation safety remained a shared international concern. Scientific interest in the discovery extended beyond aviation circles. Glaciologists saw an opportunity to study how ice movement had transported and preserved the wreckage over 5 decades. Climate researchers noted that the revelation of the crash site corresponded with accelerated glacier retreat due to global warming, raising questions about what other secrets might be hidden in the world's ice. The timing of the discovery seemed almost prophetic, occurring just 2 years before the 50th anniversary of Stardust's disappearance. The long wait was finally ending, and one of aviation's greatest mysteries was about to yield its secrets to modern investigation techniques that had been unimaginable in 1947. Yet, even as the physical mystery of Stardust's location was solved, deeper questions remained. What had caused an experienced crew to make fatal navigation errors? How had weather conditions contributed to the accident? And what had Dennis Harmer been trying to say with that enigmatic final word? The ice had given up its most obvious secret, the location of Stardust's final resting place. But the mountain still held other mysteries, waiting for human investigation to piece together the final moments of one of aviation history's most famous flights. The recovery expedition that would follow would provide answers to some questions while raising others, continuing the complex process of understanding what had happened on that August afternoon in 1947. The discovery marked not an ending, but a new beginning in the Stardust story. After 50 years of speculation and theory, investigators finally had physical evidence to examine. The patient mountains had finally begun to surrender their secrets, though they would not give them up easily. The recovery expedition that reached Mount Tupungato in February 2000 represented one of the most challenging archaeological operations ever undertaken in the high Andes. Led by the Argentine Army with international cooperation, the mission combined military logistics with scientific methodology to extract evidence from one of the world's most hostile environments. The team that assembled for the operation included mountain warfare specialists from the Argentine Army, forensic experts, aviation investigators, and glaciologists. Each member had been specially selected for their expertise and ability to work effectively at high altitude and extreme conditions. The logistical challenges of supporting such a team at 15,000 feet in the Andes were enormous. Helicopter operations at such altitude pushed aircraft to their operational limits. The thin air reduced lift capacity and engine performance, while unpredictable mountain weather could ground flights without warning. Every piece of equipment, every kilogram of supplies had to be carefully calculated and transported in multiple trips when conditions permitted. The crash site itself presented a sobering spectacle. 50 years of glacier movement had spread Stardust's remains across a wide area of steep, icy terrain. Pieces of the aircraft had emerged from the ice at different times and locations, creating a complex three-dimensional puzzle that investigators had to reconstruct from scattered clues. The largest recognizable components were parts of the four Rolls-Royce Merlin engines, their distinctive shape still identifiable despite decades of glacial transport. These massive pieces of machinery, weighing hundreds of pounds each, had traveled considerable distances from the original impact site as the glacier slowly carried them downhill. Propeller blades twisted into impossible curves by the violence of the impact provided evidence of the engine's operating condition at the moment of collision. The damage patterns indicated that all four engines had been developing near cruise power when Stardust struck the mountain, supporting the theory that the aircraft had been in normal flight rather than experiencing mechanical problems. Aircraft structural components told the story of an instantaneous, catastrophic breakup. Aluminum panels were twisted and torn, their original shapes barely recognizable. The fuselage had been completely destroyed, leaving only fragments scattered across hundreds of yards of glacier. The violence of the impact had exceeded anything the aircraft's structure could possibly withstand. Personal effects began to emerge from the ice as the recovery team worked systematically through the debris field. These items, pieces of clothing, personal belongings, and human remains, brought the tragedy into sharp personal focus. After 50 years, Stardust's passengers and crew were finally being recovered from their icy tomb. The preservation achieved by the glacial environment was extraordinary. Fabric items retained much of their original color and texture, leather goods remained supple, and even paper documents were partially readable. The glacier had functioned as a natural deep freeze, protecting organic materials from the decay that would have occurred under normal conditions. Human remains recovered from the site were remarkably well preserved, allowing forensic experts to conduct detailed examinations that would have been impossible with remains exposed to normal environmental conditions for half a century. The ice had protected not only the physical remains, but also the genetic material that would prove crucial for identification purposes. The discovery of 3 torsos, 1 foot and 1 hand, represented only a portion of Stardust's human casualties, but these remains would prove sufficient for advanced forensic analysis. The preservation was so complete that pathologists could determine details about the victims' final moments and the nature of their injuries. DNA analysis, a technology unavailable during the original 1947 investigation, became the key to identifying the recovered remains. Samples were carefully extracted and sent to specialized laboratories where modern genetic analysis could match them with DNA from surviving family members. The DNA matching process took nearly 2 years to complete, requiring painstaking comparison of genetic markers with samples provided by relatives of Stardust's victims. The technology that made this identification possible had been developed decades after the aircraft's disappearance, representing a triumph of modern science applied to a historical mystery. In 2002, the results were announced. DNA analysis had successfully identified 5 of the 8 British passengers and crew members whose remains had been recovered. Captain Reginald Cook, radio operator Dennis Harmer, and passengers Paul Simpson, Jack Gooderham, and Peter Young were positively identified through genetic matching. The identification process brought closure to families who had waited over 50 years for confirmation of their loved one's fate. For some, living relatives were able to participate in the DNA matching process, providing biological samples that linked them across generations to family members who had vanished in 1947. The successful identifications also demonstrated the remarkable preservation capability of glacial ice. Genetic material that would have degraded within years under normal conditions had remained stable for over half a century in the deep freeze of the Tupungato Glacier system. Aircraft components recovered from the crash site provided valuable insights into 1940s aviation technology and manufacturing techniques. Metallurgical analysis of aluminum components revealed information about alloy composition and production methods used during the immediate post-war period. Engine components were particularly informative, showing the condition of the Rolls-Royce Merlin engines at the time of impact. Investigators could determine that all 4 engines had been operating normally when Stardust struck the mountain, eliminating mechanical failure as a contributing factor to the accident. The propeller damage. Patterns provided evidence of engine power settings at impact. The distinctive twisting and bending of the propeller blades indicated that the engines had been developing substantial power, consistent with normal cruise operation, rather than an emergency or power-reduced condition. Landing gear components, remarkably well preserved in the glacial ice, included one tire that remained inflated after more than 50 years of burial. This extraordinary preservation demonstrated the protective qualities of the high-altitude ice environment and provided researchers with intact examples of 1940s aviation technology. The investigation also revealed details about the impact sequence and aircraft orientation at the moment of collision. The debris pattern and component damage indicated that Stardust had struck the mountain in a slight nose-down attitude while maintaining normal flight speed, supporting the controlled flight into terrain theory. Weather analysis, using modern meteorological understanding, confirmed that Stardust had encountered much stronger headwinds than forecast on the day of the Aviation accident. Jet stream activity on August 2, 1947, had been significantly more intense than the primitive weather forecasting of the era could predict or communicate to flight crews. The headwind effect would have reduced Stardust's ground speed substantially without alerting the crew to their true position relative to the terrain. Using the dead reckoning navigation techniques available in 1947, the crew would have calculated their position based on airspeed and elapsed time, not accounting for the effect of unexpected winds on their actual progress over the ground. This navigation error, compounded over hours of flight, would have left Stardust considerably short of her calculated position when the crew began their descent toward Santiago. What they believed to be a safe descent over Chilean territory was actually a descent into the high peaks of the Continental Divide. The recovery operation also provided insights into glacier behavior and the effects of climate change on high-altitude ice systems. The timing of the discoveries, beginning in the late 1990s, corresponded with accelerated glacial retreat due to global warming. Objects buried for decades were emerging as the ice that had preserved them began to melt and recede. Glaciologists studying the Tupungato system noted that the rate of ice loss had accelerated significantly in recent decades. This retreat was not only revealing long-buried artifacts like Stardust's remains, but also threatening the water supplies of millions of people who depended on glacial melt for irrigation and urban water systems. The recovery expedition documented the crash site thoroughly, creating a comprehensive record of the wreckage distribution and preservation conditions. This documentation would prove valuable for future researchers studying both the accident itself and the processes by which glacial systems preserve and reveal historical artifacts. Argentine Air Force investigators, working with international colleagues, produced a final report that officially closed the Stardust case after more than 50 years of investigation. The report concluded that the aircraft had been lost due to controlled flight into terrain, caused by navigation errors resulting from unexpectedly strong headwinds and the limitations of 1940s navigation technology. The report also officially exonerated Captain Cook and his crew of any negligence or recklessness. The investigation found that the crew had followed standard procedures throughout the flight, and that their navigation errors were the result of conditions beyond their control, given the technology available at the time. This official vindication was important for the crew's surviving family members, who had lived for decades under the shadow of speculation about what might have caused the accident. The final report made clear that the crew had been victims of a circumstance rather than authors of their own misfortune. The mystery of the final radio transmission, STENDEC, remained officially unsolved despite the recovery of the wreckage. None of the physical evidence provided additional clues about what Dennis Harmer had been attempting to communicate in those final moments, leaving this aspect of the case as puzzling as ever. However, investigators noted that the controlled flight into terrain scenario was consistent with several of the proposed explanations for the mysterious transmission. If Harmer had been attempting to communicate the aircraft's descent or position, various transmission errors or abbreviation interpretations could have produced the word that puzzled ground controllers. The recovery operation marked the end of one of aviation's longest-running mysteries, but it also demonstrated the value of persistence in accident investigation. Modern technology had finally provided answers to questions that had remained unanswerable for over half a century, showing that some mysteries simply require time and technological advancement to solve. The case also highlighted the importance of international cooperation in aviation safety investigations. The successful recovery and analysis of Stardust remains had required coordination between multiple countries, military organizations, and scientific institutions, demonstrating that aviation safety remains a shared global concern. For the families of Stardust's passengers and crew, the recovery operation provided the closure that had been missing for over 50 years. After decades of uncertainty, they finally knew what had happened to their loved ones and could lay them to rest with dignity and certainty. The mountains had finally surrendered their secret, yielding to human persistence and scientific advancement. Stardust's long sleep in the ice was over, and with it, one of aviation history's most enduring mysteries had finally found its resolution. Epilogue. The whisper in the ice. If you are still listening, let these final moments settle softly around. You're like snow on a quiet mountain peak. Picture the cockpit lamps of stardust, glowing amber in the thin air above the Andes. Picture Dennis Harmer's hand on the radio key, tapping out the familiar rhythms of Morse code. Picture the crew working with quiet competence, following procedures that had served them well through war and peace. Estimated time of arrival, Santiago at 5:45 in the evening. STENDEC. The word leaves the aircraft, travels through the crystalline air, and arrives in a ground operator's headset. It is heard, questioned, and transmitted twice more. Then silence. Somewhere far below, a glacier begins its slow work of preservation and concealment. For 51 winters, the ice keeps its counsel, holding safe the evidence of what happened on that August afternoon. Snow falls, seasons turn, and the world changes in ways that the crew of Stardust could never have imagined. The radio operators who worked in Morse code are replaced by digital systems. Navigation by dead reckoning gives way to satellites that know position within meters. Weather forecasting advances from educated guessing to sophisticated computer modeling. The dangerous adventure of commercial aviation becomes routine transportation. Yet, through all these changes, the mountains remember. Deep in the ice of Mount Tupungato, Stardust waits patiently for the slow processes of climate and geology to reveal her secrets. The glacier moves at its own pace, measuring time not in human years, but in geological ages. When the ice finally surrenders its treasure in 1998, it tells a story both tragic and ordinary. An experienced crew, flying a reliable aircraft, encounters conditions beyond their control and understanding. Navigation errors, compounded by weather, create a situation where safe procedures lead to disaster. There are no villains in this story, only victims of circumstance and the limitations of their time. The families who waited so long for answers received them at last, along with the peaceful knowledge that death came instantly to those they loved. The crew's professional reputation is restored, cleared of any suspicion of negligence or error. The aircraft herself, revealed in fragments scattered across the glacier, tells her own story of sudden, violent impact and the remarkable preservation that follows. But some mysteries remain unsolved. The word STENDEC continues to puzzle investigators and enthusiasts, a linguistic ghost that may never be fully explained. Perhaps it is fitting that one element of the story should remain unexplained, a reminder that not all questions have answers, not all puzzles can be solved. The broader lessons of Stardust's story extend beyond aviation into the realm of human persistence and the power of time to reveal truth. Modern technology eventually provides answers that were impossible to find with the tools available in 1947. DNA analysis identifies remains, metallurgical science explains failure modes, and climatology reveals how glaciers preserve and transport evidence across decades. Stardust's story is ultimately one of transformation. Military aircraft converted to civilian use, wartime crews finding peacetime employment, families separated by conflict-seeking reunion across continents. It is a story of the early days of international aviation, when flying remained an adventure and the world seemed both larger and smaller than it does today. The aircraft that carried the name Stardust was part of the first generation of truly global air transportation, connecting distant continents and making the world smaller through the speed of flight. Her loss was part of the price paid for this transformation, a reminder that progress often comes at the cost of those who push the boundaries of the possible. In the end, Stardust teaches us about patience, persistence, and the long arc of discovery. The families who waited 50 years for answers demonstrate the enduring power of love and memory. The investigators who never gave up show the importance of keeping faith with the dead. The mountain itself, slowly yielding its secrets to the pressure of changing climate, reminds us that truth has its own timeline. The ice that preserved Stardust's remains for half a century is disappearing now, victim of the same climate change that revealed the aircraft's location. As glaciers retreat around the world, they are likely to yield other secrets, other long lost artifacts and remains that will help us understand our past. But Stardust's emergence from the ice marks more than just the solution to an aviation mystery. It represents the triumph of human curiosity and scientific advancement over the apparent impossibility of solving a case where all evidence had vanished. It shows that some questions, even after decades without answers, are worth continuing to ask. For those who knew Stardust's passengers and crew, the aircraft's final revelation brought both sadness and peace. The uncertainty that had haunted them for 50 years was finally resolved, allowing grief to complete its natural cycle and memory to focus on life rather than death. For aviation professionals, the case demonstrates the importance of learning. From every accident, even those that seem to offer no lessons. The navigation errors that doomed Stardust led to improved weather reporting, better understanding of high-altitude winds, and development of navigation systems that make such errors nearly impossible today. For all of us, Stardust's story offers a meditation on time, patience, and the eventual revelation of truth. In our age of instant information and immediate answers, the aircraft's half-century sleep in the ice reminds us that some truths emerge slowly, in their own time, in their own way. The mountains that claimed Stardust continue to challenge aviation, though modern technology has made them far less dangerous than they were in 1947. Pilots still approach the Andes with respect, understanding that these ancient peaks demand attention and competence from all who would cross them. Somewhere in the ice, fragments of stardust may still remain, slowly making their way down the mountain as the glacier continues its patient flow toward the valleys below. Each piece that emerges tells part of the story, adding details to our understanding of what happened on that August afternoon so long ago. The radio waves that carried Dennis Harmer's final transmission have long since faded into the cosmic background. Radiation. But the word STENDEC continues to echo in the minds of those fascinated by aviation mysteries. Perhaps one day someone will discover its meaning, adding the final piece to Stardust's puzzle. Until then, the aircraft rests in the memory of those who knew her story, a silver ghost from aviation's more dangerous era, when pilots navigated by stars and dead reckoning, when weather reports were educated guesses, and when flying remained an act of courage as much as skill. Stardust's passengers, pursuing their various missions and dreams across the vast distances of the post-war world, found their journeys ending not in Santiago's sunlight, but in the eternal cold of an Andean glacier. Yet their stories lived on in the memories of those who loved them, and in the patient search for truth that finally brought them home. The aircraft that bore the name Stardust has become part of aviation legend, her story told and retold wherever pilots gather to speak of flying's more dangerous past. She reminds us that every flight, no matter how routine, represents a small victory over gravity, weather, and the fundamental hostility of the three-dimensional world in which aircraft must operate. Now you know the story too. Rest well, knowing that even the deepest mysteries may someday find their answers, that truth has a way of emerging from the most unlikely places, and that love and memory can survive any amount of time and distance. The whisper in the ice has finally been heard. Stardust has come home at last.